I hope this chat works this time. Let's see. Can somebody type something? Maybe I can see. Hey, Kelly. Hey, it's working this time. I mean, I put that to prayer. If you listen hard enough, you can hear Reveille singing. Hear it? She's grooving. I was trying to figure out a way to put some music in the beginning. She's providing it for us. I hope you can hear it because it's so cute. So I'm gonna give a few minutes for everybody again. Did you get the handout, Kelly, or the thing in the email? I know it's long. Sorry. She's so loud. Oh, don't look at it while you're driving. But I'm glad you got it. She's singing Look Up Child and she's rocking it. And Matthew's just waiting on me because we've like gone through all the historical type. Hey, Tracy. We just went through all these historical dramas on Netflix, and so we were bummed because we're waiting on like Vikings to come back. I think in November, but we stumbled upon AD. I don't know if anybody's heard of that, but AD, the Kingdom and Empire. Hey, Lens. AD, Kingdom and Empire. It is the New Testament. I wanted to share that with everybody. I don't know if everybody's got Netflix, but it's so good. And I wanted to mention it because of what we're going over tonight. The whole time I was watching it, I was like, this is pulling from the book of Matthew, and this is pulling from the book of John. So I'm hoping that some of the stuff that we go over tonight, that if anybody heads over and starts watching AD on Netflix, and if you binge watch it like I've been doing, some of these things you'll notice, especially after tonight. I think it's so cool. It's from the same people that produced the Bible movies. What is her name? Roma Downey. I don't know if y'all know who I'm talking about. But the same people that produced that mini series that came on TV a couple of years ago, like the really good one. Same folks, and they're doing a really good job. I think on it. There's some details, but who wants to be that picky? But it's really good. I'm just turning everybody onto that. I'll give one more minute, see if anybody else wants to get in. Touched by an Angel, you're right. That's okay. That's her, but she's now set about the business of coming up with Lindsay. She's now gone about the business of producing like these really amazing, high quality films about the Gospels. Really neat stuff. I think it's cool. I like that she's doing that. Okay, so 8:04. It's freezing in my house, and then also too, full disclosure, because I don't know how to keep it at 10. I still get nervous doing this, so I get like a little cold. So I put on like a $1 shirt I got from Rouse's. The name. It's called AD Kingdom and Empire, or Empire and Kingdom. I don't even know. You'll understand the title whenever we go through tonight. It's amazing. I love this show. We've been watching it. It's mine and Matthew's show now. I never want it to end, but of course, at the rate that I'm consuming it, it's not going to last through the weekend. So AD Kingdom and Empire, and it's on Netflix. Okay, so 8:05. Let's Let's roll. Okay, so finally we're in the New Testament. This is my jam. Preparing for tonight, I kept going down rabbit holes where I was just like, "Ooh, and now we can talk about this, and now we can talk about that." And I called Aunt Tracy to get some guidance on like what should I just limit it to, because if I'm not careful, I will just create this entire commentary, which a commentary is an actual thing. It's very big and in depth, and I'll do that. And I kept trying to remind myself, this is just to be a good guide. So I reined it in, and I think tonight what we're just going to cover is more a little bit more history. So don't like click off yet. You're just like, no. But I mean, it's all history, right? But some of this is cultural history, and just to give you a really good backdrop. I think this is the most important information, because otherwise the story, it can just be black and white, and it could just be letters and words on a page, and it loses its zing, and it doesn't leap off the pages like it should. But after tonight, hopefully it really will. So just the basics, the way that we've covered everything else so far, is the composition of the New Testament. 27 books, a collection over time, a very much shorter period of time than, say, the Old Testament, right? And in that, just what it lacks in breadth, it's just about this thick. It certainly makes up for in depth. The problem I have in particular with the New Testament is I can't go a sentence without immediately leaping to something else. Not because I can't keep my attention, but because I feel like every single sentence is just packed with something for me. And if you're not there yet, you will get there. Like we said in the beginning, it was originally written in the Greek, and there were some parts Aramaic, because that's what Jesus and his disciples would have spoken, because they were in Galilee, which is sort of north of Jerusalem at the time, and that was their native tongue, or not their native tongue, but that was the tongue that they spoke. Keep in mind, they would have been able to read Hebrew, because the Tanakh is what they had to study. So hopefully those are just little things that you're connecting, and I'm just throwing that out there just so that you can know whenever you're reading it, some words, and we'll visit that, but some words that we might know to mean something meant a little something different in the Greek, and maybe even a little something different in the Aramaic, and so that was covered in translation. How to read the New Testament. I've got my notes, the same ones that I sent y'all. I wanted to make sure that we just follow along together. So how to read the New Testament, very much like the way you would read the Old Testament. I will preach it till the day I die. Context and perspective. You have to set aside your modern day perspectives and your modern day experiences and become one of them. And the way you do that is to know a little bit about, the culture that they're in, the political atmosphere. And that's why I'm going to make sure that we go over some of those things before we even leap in. You can section out the New Testament in 5 parts. Usually it's it's generally accepted that you do the Gospels, and then Acts, and then Pauline epistles. An epistle just means letters, and then the general letters or general epistles, and then Revelations. You can also look at it in the same way. Gospels are the history of Christ's life and ministry, and then Acts would be the history of the church, and then Paul's letters, that would be just letters to the churches that Paul set up, and then the letters that are general, that's kind of general to all churches, and then Revelation would be prophecy. Revelations is the one that I know the least, simply because that's kind of where I'm at in my walk. I still need to dive deeper into Revelations. Just letting you know, everybody's got something that they're still trying to work on. Let's see. So tonight We're going to orient ourselves into the political atmosphere of the New Testament. I don't, and then we'll do the Gospels. I don't know about you, but for me, even whenever I was more mature in my faith, I would get the concepts and I'd get Jesus's metaphors, and I understood certain things that I felt like I was deep into the Word. I got it, but the things that still were details that I would just kind of like, not important, would be, the relationship between Rome and the Jewish leadership. I never quite understood it. Where they were going and when they were there and all of those things. I understood they were on the move, but I didn't quite get where they were at. Just some of these details that I didn't think were that important. And whenever I made it my business to understand them, what Christ did sunk in even deeper, to the point that sometimes even if I'm just in my prayer and I'm thanking him for what he did, it will shake my core. So we'll move on. And kind of what I was saying is, like, you do want to dive in, but I want to just pump the brakes and just let's review. So at the end of the Old Testament, we closed out with Malachi, and they were waiting on the prophesied king, the one that would bring about the kingdom of God, would give Israel a new heart. In the Old Testament, it kept saying that Israel needed a new heart because it just kept going back into sin. But when the Old Testament closes, that king never appears. And so 400 years later, we open with the New Testament. And we're going to continue God's rescue plan. So that's what the New Testament is. So you can kind of just think of it in those terms. So where are we now when we go into the New Testament? We're in Israel. Surprise. And we're under Roman control. And at this point, Rome is occupying Israel, but the Jewish community exists with some autonomy. So they're allies. And so there's no ill will. They actually they coexist peacefully at this point. Does anybody already know that, or is this kind of something new for them? I want to make sure that I am utilizing this chat function because this is the first time it's actually worked in like 3 weeks. So one thing you would know is that the Greek culture heavily influenced Rome. And I don't think that's news to anybody. But recall that the Jews had gone into exile in Babylon, and they regained their freedom when Persia conquered Babylon. Eventually, Alexander the Great, he started coming into this territory. His idea was to infiltrate, the known world with Greek culture. And so power changed hands throughout the years. This is not going to be an entire history lesson, but power changed hands throughout the entire year. And for a while, it was 150 years of Greek control. So that's what we're stepping into is that's called Hellenistic, but we're stepping into this Greek culture, Roman occupied Israel, where the Jewish community is allowed and able to function with their own leadership and do so peaceably. Let's see. A super brief short review of Roman ruler history. I did want to just give you this, that by this time Rome was an empire. Romans used to have a kingship, and then the people that were oppressed, they overthrew their king. So then they moved to a republic, and they would vote in 2 councils, and then this council, if they got out of hand, they would appoint a dictator. And then that didn't work out because Julius Caesar then appointed himself dictator infinitum. And so he was murdered. And a war hero named Octavius, he had several different names, he succeeded him, and they named him Caesar Augustus. And they would then become a Roman Empire. So he would be the Caesar Augustus, the emperor of Rome, at the time that Jesus was born. Let's see, what else can I say about that? So he would be Caesar, but then he had Roman governors. Kelly, you're too brute. uh, um, so governors would be appointed to oversee the affairs of certain regions, and so Pontius Pilate was the governor in over this area at the time that Jesus' ministry, and he plays a big role in the Gospels, and you'll see about that. Let me see what else. Then I've already said they all coexisted with the Jewish leadership, and I wanted to break down the Jewish leadership to you too. I have a little section that I talk about Jewish rule, like who was really in charge, so that you know the Roman Empire appointed the leaders in the Jewish section. There was no separation of church and state. The Jewish leaders were the judge, the priest, and the rulers. And then they did have a king, but the high priest, they made a lot of the decisions. And because of this, they usually this relationship where Rome appointed the Jewish leaders, they kind of had them in their back pocket. And so I won't go any deeper than that, but just so that you know that at the time of Jesus' ministry, the opposition was not necessarily Christ in Rome. It was mostly Jewish leadership. Romans only became a serious threat a little bit later, and you see it play out in the Gospels. Paying attention to the story, we can see that the majority of the Jewish rulers and the Roman governors actually had different ideas about Christ's guilt. Okay, so I kind of covered who really opposed Christ and the apostles. I do want you to just kind of notice that it's the Jewish leadership that opposes Christ. It's the Jewish leadership that opposes the Christians, the apostles, the followers. And then there is a shift when I think it's called like the Jewish Romano War. I always say it the wrong way, get it backwards, whatever. Don't come for me because I said it the wrong way. But this war breaks out, and that's kind of, I guess it's in Emperor Nero's time, and they start persecuting the Jews. And so you do see a shift, and it does start happening, but not necessarily in the beginning. And I don't know about you, but I put it in here because I know for me it was an issue. Knowing the difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and who made up the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the Jewish council that's made up of the Jewish leaders, both political and societal, religious leaders, and they are made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. So the Pharisees would have been the radicals. These are the folks that staunchly guarded the Mosaic law and customs, and then they added some. So it's like if, I don't know why this is my favorite way to show it, but if this was the Mosaic law, it's almost like the Pharisees put this little fence around the Mosaic law and said, here, this is law too. So if you come up to this fence, that you were about to make the sin against the Mosaic law, we're going to punish you for that. Their problem, their main issue with Jesus is that he, on several occasions, made them look like fools. He basically called them out for their hypocrisy and exploiting the people and their heresy. Sadducees would have been a little bit different. They adhered strictly to the Mosaic law without these oral customs and additional laws that the Pharisees put on everyone. So oftentimes the Pharisees and the Sadducees butted heads. Their deal with Jesus was that he claimed that he was going to be resurrected, which they completely denied would even be possible. So there's more problems they had with Jesus through his teachings and everything, but that's the gist of it, so that you understand whenever you see these terms being used, it's not just opposition. You can kind of piece it all together that, really in the beginning, especially when it came to persecuting Christ, um, the Jewish leaders actually had a lot of influence on the Roman leaders on what to do. I think if you, I mean, I'm going to be paraphrasing, but if you see where Pontius Pilate said he didn't find Jesus to do any wrong, and they insisted and they pressed him, so he said, "Fine, okay, execute him. I mean, crucify him." So that's a little bit about that. What's next? All right. Oh, okay. Just one important detail about the Sanhedrin, which is, like I said, the Jewish council that made up all of these religious leaders. The trial for Christ was done at night, and it took place in one of the councilman's home. Um, it was a death penalty trial, so it had rules, and they broke them, and that's why they called it an illegal trial. Death penalty trials were supposed to be done in the day, and then if there was a conviction, that it had to be an entire day pass before that they would carry out that confirmation. So just a little lanyap. If you didn't know already, now you know. This is why they call it the illegal trial, because of how things went down. There was many other things that happened that were completely just wrong, but that's just a little something different I wanted to throw in there. Does anybody do you want to like add something or want to say something? Like I said, I want to make sure I'm getting on this chat here, ladies, because we have been through some things with this chat. I'm finally excited to talk about the Gospels. Like I said, it was difficult to figure out what I wanted to narrow this down to. So what I wanted to narrow it down to is to go through things that would trigger while you're reading, that would, empower you and make you realize that you got this. You can totally understand everything in the Bible and get everything out of it that you need to, and just keep growing in your faith. So the Gospels, most of us, Mosaic law. So Moses's law, when you go think back into Exodus, whenever they get to Mount Sinai and God gives the law, it's basically called the Mosaic law, because Moses was the one that brought it down in the Mosaic covenant. We good? All right, so the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you don't remember a Sunday school song, don't make me sing it. Somebody else sing it. But that's how I learned the books of the Bible, I think when I was 7. So, all right. Some things about the Gospels. The Gospel means the good news. A little extra here, so that we can build on our knowledge of Roman relationship to the New Testament. But this was actually this term was appropriated by the disciples, and the good news was a Greek term. So it was a special announcement that I guess they ran out into the streets whenever an emperor had a victory of some sort. So this word was first used in Mark. I'll tell you in the second handout, but the word was first used in Mark, which is, I'll tell you in a minute too, which is a neat thing. But so it was used. It was a borrowed term, and they took it and made it their own and said, this we're going to call the gospel the good news of Christ, rather than just like a good news of a victory by an emperor. It's generally accepted that the first gospel, which would have been Mark, is what's generally accepted. It would have been 30 to 40 years after Christ's ministry. I'm not a theologian, so I'm not gonna hammer down on dates. It is good to know some of the dates, though, just to orient you to everything. Let's see. And then some things that you'll notice in these particular books is there are much deeper levels, and we will go into them in the coming weeks because I feel like they're that important to go into. But things like parallels that I'll mention, paradoxes that are used that I'll mention, the parables themselves, those are things that you can do studies on forever if you wanted to, but we're limited. So we'll limit it. But that won't be tonight, but it will be for another night. So why are there 4 gospels? There are 4 gospels because they're written from different perspectives for different audiences, and the way they are written are specifically to appeal to that audience, what things that particular audience would be familiar with, or that society cared about, or anything that just spoke to that society as a whole, that would bend their ear. And have them listen to what the apostle or the disciple or whomever is writing it wanted them to understand about Christ. And human experience, I put it on the sheet. Human experience tells us that this is pretty natural, right? There's different ways and different things that we detail when we're explaining something to someone else. There's a million different reasons why we include something in a story and omit something in a story, and it's no different. One thing that I'll say is that in a court of law, Simon Greenleaf, he's a kind of like a well-known, I'm sure he was attorney at one time, but he's an expert in evidence. And one of the things that he points out is that if you have one eyewitness, it's tough. But if you have more than one eyewitness, it's really good for your case. The issue is if all of your eyewitnesses detail the exact same details and tell the exact same stories, what it tends to do is kind of look like there's been some collusion and that there's been some contrived effort to present a story a particular way. And that's not what we have here. We have 4 different perspectives that give this real like 4D, 3D, 4D view of Christ. We can see it from all different angles to get a complete story. And that I wanted to segue into some other terms that you will come to know, or it's just something good to know, is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels. It's kind of a big, like a fancy word, but all it means is that they generally they summarize the same story. John is different. It's unique in some of the way that it presents Christ. I think I said, yeah, I did say that. Also, too, you'll notice that in these 4 different gospels, chronologically, it's not always the exact same. Non-believers that are trying to pick apart the Bible, they'll say, look, contradictions. No. Just because something is not included in a story does not mean that it therefore did not occur. You say contradictory, I will say complementary. There are these ways of studying it where they call harmony gospels, where you can study how the gospels harmonize, how they where one leaves off, another gospel might have picked up, and they're not perfect, but it is a way to study the Bible, and those are available. But just wanted you to know the gospels weren't written. If they were writing a history book that needed to have specific dates and details, well, then that would have been a different purpose, right? The purpose wasn't that for any of these writers. It was to get the message out about Christ and his life and his ministry. So just keep that in mind when you're reading too. If you're going, this doesn't add up exactly, it doesn't have to. Okay. So let's see. What's next? What's a quick way to orient yourself to them? Quickly. Mark was likely the first one written, and Mark is the shortest one, and it's kind of action-packed and condensed, but it's heavy in detail. So it's commonly accepted that Matthew and Luke would have used Mark as a reference. So my best way to describe this would be, um, um, let's see, how could you describe that? So it's say it's almost like the condensement. Then Matthew and Luke would be the expansion. So let's just say Kelly and Lindsay and I have been to the beach together a couple of times. So let's just say I said, "Hey Kelly, do you remember that time we went to the beach in 2007?" And Kelly might say, "Yeah, and I also remember." That's what I mean by Mark would be the reference. So I made a reference to Kelly, and that prompted Kelly to remember another detail. Similarly, gosh, I hope I'm saying this right. Similarly, Mark would have been the reference, and Matthew and Luke would have used that to recall another detail. Gosh, I hope I made sense. Sometimes I don't, but that's just the way I think. So, okay, what else? I do want you to keep in mind that John uniquely presents these private conversations with these encounters with Christ. So where the other ones are really heavy on sermons and parables, John really makes a different shift, and what he presents is teaching can happen in a conversation with Christ. I draw from that and think, wow, my conversations happen when I'm just praying. So, and a lot of times I'll walk out of my prayer having learned something about myself or my situation or whatever it is I brought to Jesus. But, and that's why I think John is kind of a neat inclusion. Let's see. Yes, lastly, it's impossible to detail all of these things within an hour, so we're not. So what we're gonna do is, if you've got the sheet, I'm gonna show you how I kind of broke down some things, and then if I can get to all of what is in the summaries, then I will. I might just hit on some things in the summaries because I don't want you to have that summary without some sort of us reviewing it a little bit. So I'm gonna try to hustle but not be too fast. Okay, so who were they written to? Matthew's audience were the Jewish audience, the Jewish leaders, the Jewish community. We'll keep moving so that I can get to that summary page, so I can show you how I know that, how you can know that, how I'm not reinventing the wheel. This is something that when people have studied and they understand this, and you can understand it too for yourself. Mark was written to Romans and Gentiles. Luke was written for an audience that was going to be the Greek-influenced Gentiles. I do want to stop there. There's Jews and there's Gentiles. Gentiles are everybody that are not Jewish. That's it. For the longest, I knew that, but no one really ever had said, this is all that there is to that. Don't look any further into it. And John is written for everybody. When were they written? Christ's ministry began around 29 AD, and then his resurrection occurred in 33 AD. I threw in a tiny little lanyard and said that I personally don't ever say that it ended in 33 AD because it hasn't and it won't. It's just me being sassy. Mark, like I had mentioned earlier, was probably one of the earliest ones written, and that would have been about 30 to 40 years after Christ had died. So somewhere and people get all in a tizzy about the dates, but somewhere between 50 to 70 AD, it could have even been earlier. Who knows? Okay. John would have been the latest, and then because next week we're going to talk about Acts, I'm just throwing this in there that Paul the Apostle, he was killed between 64 65 AD, which would have been the time that Emperor Nero was in power. And a little bit later, on 70 AD, is whenever the temple was destroyed, as Christ predicted. So, and what does all this mean? It means that the writings were incredibly close to his death. And so a lot of us, and yes, ladies, I'm going to tell our age, a lot of us are mid-30s and on, right? So can you think of anything that happened in the 60s, 70s, or 80s that we know happened, we have well-documented evidence of, that could potentially, maybe in a couple of 100 years or 1,000 years, somebody might claim didn't happen, but we might have written it and documented it, and so we would have known that this would have happened 30 or 40 years ago. I feel like that makes this very reliable. There's other things that you can study that can drive home reliability and everything, but I'm just trying to kind of give you some context and something a little bit more hard to grasp that says, yeah, 30 or 40 years ago, I remember. I mean, I can't because I'm only 35, but something 20 years ago, I remember. Okay, so how to study the Gospels. With the tools that I'll give you later, this will really come to life. But you can check off number 1 that I have there. It says understand the cultural context. You do now if you didn't before. Now we know who's in power, who's really in power, what kind of culture is around the Jews, what's the political atmosphere. We've covered that now. So now we're good to go when we step into these Gospels. And the next is know their perspectives. We just briefly went over those, but I'll go more into detail. So we know that Matthew was speaking to the Jews, that Mark was speaking to the Romans. Well, primarily, keep that word in your mind. Primarily, it's for everybody. But then I think Luke was speaking to kind of Greek influenced Gentiles, and then John, he gives this really neat perspective that it's for everybody. When I think of John, I think of more of like a heaven down experience, and I'll explain what that means a little bit later, but because it's a little different. So anyway, and then as you're reading, you can kind of ask yourself what his teachings and what his kind of like the choices he makes and the actions he takes and the words he uses, what that says about him and who he is, so that you can identify his voice. I always tell the girls, don't let the world tell you who God is or who Christ is. You learn who he is for yourself, so that when they say who he is and they tell you who he is, you know better. Just like you would know, me, and you know that if you heard something that I said or did, if it didn't sound like me, probably wasn't like me. So I want them to use that same perspective on Christ, and you have the same perspective as well. Okay. So, and then also that last little bit is just read the crucifixion. When you're reading the Gospels, the crucifixion is the climax. So that whenever you move over to Acts and everything, you're moving into a new era, and that's just kind of help you stay oriented into what you're reading and how you can look into things. And I mentioned earlier gospel harmonies. Those are, if you're wanting to study the Gospels and find out where they kind of blend, that is something that you can study. Or you can get what's called a gospel synopsis, and that is a way you can study the differences. It's just something that you can know about, and if you keep on moving forward, those are things you can use. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly hit on the summary page, because really this is just for you to have whenever you're deciding to open up into the book of Matthew or the book of Mark, and you don't want to be lost. You want to know exactly what you're reading. So you can study the details on these a little bit more. I'm just going to hit them a little bit because I want to show what I'm talking about when I say different perspectives and different audiences. I gave like a little chart in the beginning of the summary, just to kind of because I like to have something that's just like a snapshot. So that's all that is. And then some key verses. So we'll quickly talk about Matthew. The title I gave right there, it says Matthew, to unbelieving Jews, here's the king you've all been waiting for. This is going to be speaking to the Jews that have come from, not the exact same people, but they know their history of how Moses led them to Mount Sinai, how they got the law, the Mosaic law, how they went into exile and how they came out and how they're here now. They treasure their customs, they treasure their law. So Matthew, he was a tax collector apostle, and here he's pulling out all the stops. He's trying to get the Jewish people to see that this is the prophesied, promised Messiah King that they've been waiting on. And his job here is to convince the unbelieving Jews, the unbelieving Jewish leaders, these deeply religious Jews, that he is the Messianic King. He is who he says he is. So how does he do that? Key things I want you to notice whenever you read Matthew. He comes out swinging on the very first chapter. He brings out genealogy. So genealogy doesn't just exist in the Old Testament for just kicks. They very much valued lineage. And in this particular genealogy, he says that Jesus is the son of Abraham and the son of David. And these are very large claims, because son of Abraham, that means that he would have come. I mean, remember, Abraham was the father of the Hebrew nation, of the Israelites. And recall back last week, whenever we talked about David being one of the kings of the United Kingdom, and he had that covenant with God. And by doing this, by laying out the genealogy and tying him to Abraham and David, he's basically putting him in the lineage, the king lineage of David, and saying he is the king of the kingdom of heaven. So there you go. And then in Matthew, he uses terminology that would have been familiar with this Jewish community. A great example of this is you'll see in there that people call Jesus rabbi. This is a Jewish term for a Jewish teacher. It's small, but you'll notice it. If you watch AD, I'm not going to tell you where it happens, but if you watch AD on Netflix, you'll see some of this that I'm talking about. They drop in rabbi. It's just a hint. They drop in rabbi, and you'll go, oh, that's used in Matthew. Okay. And then Old Testament scripture is heavy throughout Matthew. Heavy. Clearly, this is because he's trying to, this text was really valued by the Jews, so he's trying to get them to see, look, prophecy fulfilled. And he's harmonizing it with the Old Testament, but he's elevating Christ above it. And you'll see that whenever you're reading. And he also points out that he is Emmanuel, which means God with us. And he parallels Christ to Moses. I will pull those parallels out. We will go over them probably like week 6. Week 6. Because next week we need to finish up New Testament. But we'll go over them, and you'll know them, I promise. And then I give you kind of the same way we did in the Old Testament. I'm just trying to section it out for you. 3 big sections. There's an introduction, and then there's these 5 big chunks of teaching. These can be broken out in different ways. If you ever want me to do that, or if you need guidance on that, I can do it. But for brevity, I was trying to get it down pretty narrow, because you could really write several pages on Matthew. But those 5 teachings, the Sermon on the Mount, where he sends out the 12, he discusses, basically the greatness of the kingdom. He switches over to parables. I do want you to catch that. He starts off this direct teaching, and then there's rejection, and then he then shifts into doing parables. Just want you to catch it, that he went from direct teaching to indirect teaching. And then I do include the verse by verse breakdown, and I do it pretty detailed. Still not super detailed. I do it pretty detailed, and I start tapering off on the summary just because I think at some point you'll want to try to do it yourself. So I just kind of suggest what the verse breakdown could be. Do I need to pause? Does anybody want to add anything? I just talk. I am trying to look at the chat, but I just talk. Okay, I'm gonna keep going, but if I see something, I'll stop. Okay, so Mark is super action packed. He actually uses the word immediately, like every other sentence. I'm being facetious, but he does use it a lot, and this is on purpose. Mark is speaking to the Romans and the Greek influenced Gentiles. Thank you, Kelly. And his whole point is that Jesus is the Son of God, that he is a powerful, suffering servant. Keep in mind that Romans and Greek influenced folks, they care very little about religion. That's not something that they respect. What they respect is power and authority. And so they would have expected a king of a new world. They would have expected him coming in with a sword and taking over things. And Mark is kind of appealing to, this is a new kind of king. And let's see. Ooh, okay. So I'm going to hustle through this so that you can kind of, where did I put my summary? Pause. Okay. Yeah, we're back on track. Okay, so how you know that he's talking to the Romans and the Gentiles? So I'm going to hustle a little bit faster. One, I already mentioned it. He uses the term gospel. This was one way to kind of prick the ears of Romans, because this was a Roman term, and they were used to it being used in the context of announcing an emperor's victory. And here now they're hearing it as the victory of Christ. He also takes the time to explain terminology that wouldn't have had to have been explained to the Jews. Like Matthew, he doesn't explain some things. Mark stops and he actually kind of explains some Jewish customs and words and things like that. That would only mean that this was an audience not Jewish. What else? He heavily emphasized the miracles. Within these 16 chapters, he put in 27 miracles. Why? To show that although Jesus wasn't, coming in on chariots and swords and the whatnot business, he was very powerful. And that I guess I'll just go to my next one. That he was the suffering servant, that he had this power, but he didn't use it against his people. He suffered and served his people rather than making his people suffer and serve him. Lord, I hope I did that okay. Anyway, he hardly has any Old Testament references. It would not have mattered to the Romans and the Gentiles because they didn't value it as much as, say, the Jews in Matthew. He also uses fewer parables. The emphasis was on the doing. And then I gave you some of the scriptures that are kind of like hallmarks, And let's see. And I also too gave just 3 big sections. It's helpful to know, since Matthew and Luke are using Mark as a reference, this little tiny diagram I gave you where it says they're in Galilee, and then they're traveling to Jerusalem, and then they're in Jerusalem. If it helps you to know that in the Gospels, instead of knowing every single little city that they're in, then just keep that in mind. 3 places that all you really need to understand is they start off in Galilee, they start making their way to Jerusalem. There's some more to it, and then they're in Jerusalem. Okay, that might be helpful a little bit. Eventually you can break out the maps and know a little bit more and all that, but just take the pressure off yourself and just be oriented to it. Okay, and then Luke. Like I said earlier, Luke is to the general Greek audience. This is going to be people, recall just what you know from the Greek community. It was all about wisdom and philosophy. And why do I do this with my hands every time we have one of these? I'm so sorry. Wisdom, philosophy, truth, all those things. Luke was a physician, and he often traveled with Paul. He's really can be considered the first historian of the church, because Luke actually goes along with Acts. We're saving Acts until next week. And some things about Luke that are really distinct is he has very distinct parables. There's lots of them. And why? Because those parables would have been familiar to a Jewish person, but not familiar to, say, a Greek influenced Gentile, and they liked a little bit of a challenge, so he presented that. And he includes a little something for everybody. He includes parables, genealogy. He incorporates the good news. He puts exchanges in there that Jesus had with the wealthy, and exchanges that he had with the socially marginalized. He did this because Luke, I think as a doctor and as a historian at heart, he wanted to just be kind of accurate and precise about what actually went on. And like I've already said, this is a part one. The part two is Acts. And did the suggested breakdown. And then John. I like John. John basically, he's trying to convince everyone, not necessarily convince, but he's showing everyone that Christ is the Son of God, and that he offers new life, not just a new kingdom. Everything else was really centered on the kingdom of heaven was used in Matthew, and then the kingdom of God was used in pretty much all the other books. But this is a little different. This is, he offers you new life, not just a new kingdom, and an eternal life to all believers. Not just, hey, Jews, accept him as the messianic king. Not just, hey, Romans, accept him as the Son of God, and this powerful servant king, and not just this intellectually advanced king, but a king for the Greek Gentiles, but a king for everyone. And like I said, here's a way to recognize some things in John. In John, you get to see Jesus consistently, and there's 7 times say, I am. Oh, this is something I want to come back to in one of the weeks. So I think it's worth studying. But and then just a little lanyard. The last use of I am is in the garden, whenever the Roman soldiers come up and they ask, who is Jesus? Which one is Jesus? However, I'm paraphrasing. And he says, I am. Intense. John is marked by private conversations. The one that you'll know really well, or you can recall, is the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. Really want to just point out that, think about the cultural times that Jesus was alone, sitting at a well with a Samaritan woman. You can study that a little bit if I can prompt you to do that. And I think you would really find it kind of neat what you can understand from how revolutionary and out the box that was for him to do that. And that helps bring it to life a little bit. He uses a lot of metaphors. We will get over those. We'll learn them. By metaphors, I mean, I am the light. I am the bread of life. Those kind of things when he says that kind of stuff. Also, he includes a little question and answer format, which I kind of appreciate, because sometimes I put in the little paper that this conversation with Nicodemus that he has, Nicodemus kind of asks a question and he sets it up so that Jesus can explain. And then one of my favorite things. I just love the story of Lazarus, from Jesus returning to raise his friend from the tomb and from the dead, from the dead. Jesus, so that you understand, returning to raise Lazarus from the dead, that was the most selfless, most dangerous thing he could have did. He essentially delivered himself into the hands of the Jewish leaders and those that wanted him dead. He returned and he knew it. Love the story of Lazarus. I think one time I shared that story at a bar race that BJ and Anna invited me to come and just deliver the Sunday message, and I spoke about that, just because I love it that much. Anyway, so we got through all of it. I mean, like I said, I didn't want to go through every single bit of the summary. I just wanted to go over at least the distinct differences, so that when you read your Gospels, if you're in Matthew, take this summary, pull it out, just briefly read over it. You can use my sectional, you can use the verse by verse, or break it down the way you want to. You do not have to follow the way that I've done it. This is just what I came up with. You do you, boo. And I will fully support it. And if you need help, I am here for you. So next week, we'll finish up the rest of the New Testament, just kind of the way we did the Old Testament, where I gave you like a little diagram, and I'll make sure that it all pulls in with the Gospels too. But we can get through it all because of the way that we'll arrange it. I love the Paul's letters. I think you can sit and meditate on anything in any letter for anything in your life. But hopefully you're excited about keeping moving forward. You're excited for like the weeks where we will dive into parables and parallels and paradoxes, and that's when we start really diving into the word, and I feel like you'd be sufficiently prepared. So does anybody want to say anything? We got a few more minutes. You guys have been awesome. I've been seeing y'all right on there. Hopefully somebody will check out AD and get just as addicted as I am. I don't want to be alone in this. Well, I mean, I'm not. Matthew likes it too. But I'm hoping that everybody's week goes good. Your weekend is blessed too. There's several people that I'm praying for that have some illnesses, some health illnesses. There's some family situations that we hope to work out in our favor. If you've got prayer requests, if you're not comfortable putting them on the Facebook, or if you're not comfortable, sharing them on here, I happen to be the perfect secret keeper because I cannot remember anything. So secret safe with me. And not only that, I tend to really honor any sort of request to kind of keep something that's dear to your heart, protected. So I love y'all. I hope you enjoyed tonight. I just chatted it up and tried to do the best I could with just making a concise as possible, guys. Kelly, I hope you're driving safe wherever you're going. And BJ, I'm glad you got to join up, even if it was like, it's going to be recorded. I'm going to have to retake my thumbnail picture, though. I look crazy. I don't know what I was doing. I didn't realize it was being taken. So if you see this weird thumbnail pop up, I'm going to fix it. All right. Love you. Bless you. See you soon. Email me, message me, whatever. We'll chat later. Bye.